Montana Territory, early spring of 1883. Snow still clung to the north-facing slopes, and the wind off the crazy mountains could cut through a woman's bones. Olive Forrester had not spoken a word in 4 days, not since she'd found the letter. Not since she'd stood by the barn, wind snapping her skirt against her legs, and read her husband's neat, cruel handwriting. "I never meant to stay. I got what I came for. The land's yours now. Do what you want with it." Her hands had shaken, but she'd folded the letter and slipped it into her coat pocket like it was something ordinary. Then she'd walked back into the little cabin and told her 2 children, 8-year-old Pearl and 6-year-old Peter, that their father had gone east for good. He had not even said goodbye. Now, with the last of the firewood dwindling in the box and Pearl coughing through the night from cold air slipping in the cracks, Olive knew she had to act. The nearest town was Willow Creek, a half-day's ride through rough trails and melting snow. She hitched up the mule and pushed down the ache in her chest. There was no room for crying. The children stayed behind with Mrs. Keene, an older widow who lived a mile down the slope. "Do not worry," the woman had said, laying a frail hand on Olive's arm. "Come back quick. They will be fine." It was nearing dusk when Olive's wagon wheel cracked clean in 2 at the edge of town. Her body jerked forward with the jolt, and she barely managed to catch herself. She climbed down, wrenched the wool shawl tighter around her shoulders, and looked around for help. Smoke curled from the roof of the livery stable, and the hammer of a farrier echoed off the buildings. She walked toward it, boots crunching in the last crust of snow. Inside, the warmth hit her like a breath. A man stood with his back to her, sleeves rolled up, thick dark hair curling at his neck. He was driving nails into a horse's shoe, steady and sure, his movements practiced and strong. "Excuse me," Olive said, her voice rough from disuse. The man straightened, turning toward her. His eyes were gray-blue, sharp but not unkind. He looked to be around 30, maybe a little older, with a jaw that had known both fights and forgiveness. "You lost?" he asked. "My wagon wheel broke outside town," she said. "I have 2 children back home and not much daylight left." He set down the hammer. "You are Olive Forrester," she blinked. "How do you know that?" "I heard about you," he said. "Your husband, he bought that land last year, said he was settling his family out by the foothills." Olive lifted her chin. "He lied." The man hesitated, then nodded once. "Name is Rylan Hart. I run the stable and smithy here." He grabbed his coat from a hook and came around the horse. "Let me take a look at your wagon." They walked back together. Her steps were stiff and her fingers ached from cold. Rylan bent to examine the wheel, then stood. "Sheared clean through," he said. "You are not going anywhere tonight." "I cannot leave my children," she said quickly. "They are with a neighbor. Snow's coming," he said gently. "You will not make it back before dark, even if the wagon was whole." He looked at her full on now, and something softened in his face. "Come warm yourself. I have stew on and a spare room in the loft. In the morning I will fix the wheel and we will get you home." Olive hesitated. "I am not trying anything," he added. "Just do not want to see you freeze out here." She looked past him toward the mountains swallowing the sun. Then she nodded. The stable was warmer than she expected. Rylan's rooms were tucked behind the tack wall, simple, clean, with a stove that radiated heat. He poured her a bowl of stew without asking, slid it across the table toward her, then sat on the other side with his own. Olive ate in silence, too hungry to pretend she was not. Rylan said nothing, just watched her with a kind of quiet patience. "You said you heard about me," she said finally. "Small towns talk. And you? I came up from Colorado last spring, needed a place where no one knew me." He shrugged. "Turns out, Willow Creek needed a man who knows horses." She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and met his eyes. My husband left us with nothing but a leaky roof and a barn full of manure. Rylan leaned back. Then he is the fool. Something in her chest cracked open at that. She looked down at her hands. I do not know how to do this alone. You are already doing it, Olive. Her eyes lifted. He was not smiling, but there was warmth in his voice, steady as the heat from the stove, sure as the way he had known to offer help without making her feel small. Later, he showed her to the loft room. It was plain, with a cot and a thick wool blanket. If you need anything, he said, pausing in the doorway, just knock. She looked at him, his broad shoulders framed by the lantern light, and nodded. Thank you, Rylan. He tipped his head and closed the door. That night, Olive lay awake under the blanket, listening to the wind scratch at the walls. She thought of Peter's laugh and Pearl's hand in hers, and the way Rylan had looked at her not with pity, but with something else. Something warmer. Morning came with pale light and the low sound of hammering. When she came downstairs, Rylan had already pulled the broken wheel into the shop. Should have it ready by midday, he said. She watched him work, the strength in his arms, the focus in his eyes. And when he caught her looking, he did not look away. By noon, the wagon was fixed. He hitched up the mule without her asking, tied his own horse behind, and rode with her back toward the foothills. The snow had started to fall by the time they reached Mrs. Keene's. Pearl ran into her arms, Peter right behind, both chattering at once. You came back, Pearl said, her voice muffled against Olive's coat. I always will, she whispered into her daughter's hair. Rylan stayed outside, brushing snow from his horse's mane. When Olive stepped back out, he looked up. Thank you, she said. He nodded. If you need anything else, wood, tools, company, you come find me. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Then, quietly, would you come in, just for supper? The children would like to meet the man who got their mother home. Rylan's eyes met hers, steady as before. I would like that, he said. And when he stepped through the door behind her, something in Olive's chest began to thaw. Not all at once, but enough to feel it. Enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, she would not have to do this alone anymore. Rylan sat quiet at the Forrester table, hat resting on his knee, boots clean from a quick scrape at the door. His hands were still marked with soot and iron dust, but he kept them folded polite in his lap. Olive moved between stove and table with the ease of a woman used to managing the small space between needs and means. Pearl kept sneaking glances at him from behind her cup of milk, and Peter, already bold, leaned forward. Are you the one who fixes horses? Rylan nodded. That's right. You fix other animals too, sometimes, he said. Though I stick to ones with hooves. Peter considered this as he chewed. Olive handed Rylan a plate beans, salt pork, and cornbread and sat across from him, her hair pulled back tight, sleeves rolled. You always been a farrier? She asked. No, he said. Started out driving cattle down near Trinidad. Learned smithing from a man who owed me a favor. Pearl looked up. Did he teach you how to make nails? Sure did, Rylan said. Big ones, little ones. Even the kind that don't bend if you hit him wrong. The girl grinned, and Olive's shoulders dropped a little. After supper, once the children were in bed and Mrs. Keene had returned to her own home under the promise the snow wouldn't get worse, Olive stood by the hearth, stirring the fire with the iron poker. Rylan stayed seated, one hand resting on his thigh, the other holding a cup of coffee she'd brewed from her dwindling stores. You didn't have to come all the way back with me, she said. I didn't mind, she turned, slow. Most men would have. I'm not most men. The wind moved against the cabin again, low and steady. Olive sat down across from him, folding her hands. Her dress was patched at the knee and the tips of her boots were scuffed raw. What brought you north? She asked. You said you needed a place where no one knew you. Rylan's gaze drifted toward the window. There was a fire, he said after a breath. Back in Colorado. Barn caught from a lightning strike. I got the animals out, but the man who owned the place, he didn't make it. Olive didn't speak. His wife blamed me for not saving him, Rylan continued. I didn't have the heart to fight it, so I left. You weren't at fault. Doesn't matter. Sometimes what's true and what people believe don't match. She looked at him then, really looked. There was nothing showy in him, no bravado. He sat with the kind of stillness that didn't ask for attention but held it just the same. I know what that's like, she said. Being judged without a voice in it, Rylan met her eyes. You do, she nodded once. The day my husband disappeared, Mrs. Keene told me folks in town were already saying I must have driven him off, that I must be hard to live with. You believe that? No, she said. But I believed it for a moment, and that was enough to pull me under. He didn't answer right away. Then, quiet, you seem steady to me. Her throat tightened, but she didn't let it show. She stood and reached for his empty cup. You should stay the night. Snow's thickening. I'll bed down in the barn. There's a cot by the stove. You'll be warmer there. She paused. Children sleep hard. They won't stir. He nodded, stood, and followed her to the corner near the fire where the spare cot lay folded. She handed him a wool blanket without a word and turned toward the ladder to the loft. Olive, he said before she stepped away. She looked back. I'm not going anywhere unless you ask me to. There was no answer to that, not with words. So she gave him a look that held something close to thanks, maybe more, and climbed the ladder without turning again. Down below, Rylan laid out the cot. The fire snapped as if in approval. Outside, the wind curled around the corners of the cabin, but inside, the warmth held. And up in the loft, Olive lay awake again, but this time not from fear. Something else churned beneath her ribs. Not hope, not yet, but the beginning of it. The snow eased by morning, leaving a thin crust across the pasture and a hush over the trees. Rylan had already hauled wood in and stacked it by the door before Olive stirred. She stepped down from the loft in her thick stockings, hair still braided from sleep, and found him seated at the table, sharpening his knife with long, even strokes. You didn't have to do that, she said, glancing at the woodpile. I was up, he said. Felt wrong to sit. Peter was on the floor, tracing wagon wheels into the hearth dust with a stick. Pearl sat beside him, wrapping cloth around a corn husk doll. The quiet came easy, as if he'd always belonged in that room. Olive busied herself with the coffee, though the beans were nearly gone. She measured carefully, then poured water from the kettle. Rylan didn't speak until she set a cup in front of him. Roof's leaking near the north beam. She looked up. I saw the stain over your stovepipe, he said. If it softens more, it'll drop into your cooking. She crossed her arms. I've been meaning to fix it, just didn't have the ladder for it. I'll bring one out tomorrow. He took a sip. You've got a good place here. Solid bones. It was my father's, she said. He built it with my uncle before the war. I was born just over by the old cottonwood. Rylan nodded. He leave it to you. He gave it to my husband as a wedding gift. Her voice thinned. Said a man ought to start with something under his feet. Rylan didn't answer, and she didn't fill the silence. They let it settle between them. Later, while the children gathered eggs from the coop, Olive stood beside the post fence watching the clouds shift above the ridgeline. Rylan joined her with his coat open, hat pulled low. You've got hens, a mule, and what looks like a stubborn goat out back, he said. You planning to keep the place going yourself? Her chin lifted. I don't plan to leave it to rot. You know anything about fencing? Enough not to cut my hands open, she said. Why? You've got a section near the creek sagging. Come spring, the runoff will knock it flat. I was hoping to trade for new posts in town. I've got cedar poles drying in my shed. I'll bring them when I come with the ladder. She eyed him. You offering to fix half my land? No, he said. Just the part that's falling down." She didn't ask what he wanted in return. He hadn't asked for anything yet. That afternoon, they walked the pasture line while Peter and Pearl played under the birch trees. Rylan pointed out where the frost heave had shifted the posts, where the wire had rusted through. Olive listened, arms folded against the wind, her cheeks raw from cold. "You ever think about planting?" he asked. "Soil's good here." "I've thought about it," she said. "But seed's dear, and I've no one to turn the ground." "I've got a plow team. You call, I'll bring them." She narrowed her eyes. "Why?" Rylan leaned on the fence rail and looked out at the snow-patched field. "Because it would be a waste to let this land go quiet." She didn't know what to say to that. They returned to the cabin as the light began to fall. Pearl ran ahead, her cheeks pink from cold, and Peter chased after, waving a stick like a saber. Inside, Olive set cornbread in the oven and stirred a pot of dried apples softened with molasses. Rylan sat at the table, hat on the peg, watching her move. "You always this stubborn?" he asked. She glanced over her shoulder. "You always this helpful?" He grinned faintly. "Only when I see someone worth the effort." The room went still. Even the stove seemed to quiet. Olive turned back to the apples without a word, but her hand slowed. The spoon moved in slow, thoughtful circles, and the scent of warm fruit filled the air. After supper, she walked him to the door. The wind had picked up again, brushing snow off the eaves. "I'll come with the ladder after sunrise," he said. "Bring the cedar while I'm at it." She nodded, arms folded tight across her chest. "The barn'll be open." Rylan looked down at her, then past her toward the hills where the stars were just beginning to show. "Olive," he said. She met his eyes. "I don't expect anything. You understand?" "I do." He hesitated. "But I won't pretend I haven't thought about it." She didn't flinch. "Neither will I," she said. He stepped off the porch, boots crunching into the hardened snow. She watched until he rounded the bend and disappeared into the dark. That night, she lay in bed with her hair unbraided, staring at the ceiling. The fire below popped once, and she heard Peter turn in his sleep. The wind rattled the shutters, but she didn't pull the blanket tighter. She was warm already. By the time Rylan turned his horse into Olive's yard the next morning, the frost had melted into the soil, leaving the ruts soft and deep. He rode with the cedar posts bundled behind him, a ladder balanced across his pack mule, and a canvas roll of tools strapped at his saddle. Olive was already outside, sleeves pushed up, dragging a length of wire from the barn. Her braid hung loose over one shoulder, and she didn't stop when she saw him. "You're earlier than I expected," she said. "Ground's got give," Rylan answered. "Best time to sink posts." He unloaded in silence, and she led him to the fence line near the creek where the old posts leaned like tired bones. Peter and Pearl had been sent up the hill with Mrs. Keen to gather saplings for kindling, and the house stood quiet behind them, chimney trailing a thin line of smoke. Rylan drove the first post with a rhythm that matched the sound of water rushing beneath the thaw. Olive held the rails steady, boots planted, her breath fogging in the cool air. "You used to work with your hands?" he asked, pausing to wipe his brow. "My father didn't raise idle daughters," she said. "I learned to drive a team before I learned to read." He raised an eyebrow. "You read?" "Well enough to keep accounts." "Well enough to know when I've been lied to." His hand stilled on the post driver. "Did your husband lie often?" She didn't answer right away. "Then, he lied when it counted." Rylan didn't press. He set the next post, tamping down the soil with a firm boot. The silence between them wasn't heavy. It worked the way good silences do, broad enough for thoughts to stretch out inside. As the sun lifted, Olive fetched jerky and bread from the house, and they ate sitting on the fence rail, the smell of thawed earth rising from beneath their boots. "You ever think about leaving?" Rylan asked. This lands in my bones. I wouldn't know who I was somewhere else. He nodded. I've run so long I forgot what it feels like to stay. She chewed her bread slowly, eyes on the creek. Then how do you know when you've found a place worth staying for? I'm starting to, he said. Her eyes flicked to him, quick and searching. Because of the land. No, Rylan said. Because of who's on it. They didn't speak after that, not until the last post was sunk and the wire pulled taut and tied off. When they returned to the yard, Olive lifted the ladder from the mule herself. I'll hold while you climb. Rylan didn't argue. She braced the legs against the sodden ground while he scaled the rungs, a hammer tucked into his belt. From the roof, he called down, "You've got a split shingle letting in meltwater." I figured. I'll patch it for now. You'll need replacements come summer. I'll trade for them in Willow Creek, she said. I can mill you some from the cedar I've got laid up. She shaded her eyes with her hand. You planning to give me every board on your land? He smiled, not broadly, just enough to crease the corner of his mouth. Only the ones that might keep you dry. When the patch was done, Rylan came down and unwound a strip of cloth to wipe his hands. He didn't speak until she met his eyes again. You're not afraid of work, he said. I can't afford to be. He stepped forward. And you don't look for help unless you've already tried doing it alone. Her jaw tightened. I won't be a burden. You're not, he said. And I didn't come here to rescue anybody. Then why are you here? Rylan looked past her, toward the ridge where the wind bent the trees in slow waves. Because you don't hide behind what's happened to you. You face it. And that kind of strength makes a man want to stand beside it. The wind tugged at the hem of her dress. She didn't move, her hands still at her sides. I don't trust easy, she said. I wouldn't ask you to. But I see how you are with my children. And I see the way you wait for me to speak before you step forward. His voice dropped. Then maybe you're starting to see me. She looked at him for a long time, not with the guarded edge she'd worn in town, but with something quieter. A woman who'd braced herself against the world for so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to lean. You should stay for supper, she said. He nodded. I will. That evening, the children returned with their arms full of saplings and cheeks pink from wind. Peter showed Rylan the smoothest one, claiming it would make a fine fishing pole come summer. Pearl asked if he knew how to play fiddle, and when he said no, she declared she'd teach him once she remembered how. At the table, Rylan carved roast with the ease of a man used to feeding more than himself. Olive passed him the beans without being asked. Their hands brushed briefly and neither looked away. After the children were asleep, she walked him to the door again. The snow had gone and the wind had softened. Rylan shifted his hat under his arm. I'll come back with the shingles when I've cut them. I'll have coffee ready, Olive said. He hesitated. There's more I could help with, I know. I'm not looking for a place to rest my boots. I'm looking for something I can belong to. Her voice was quiet. I think you already do. He stepped down from the porch, then paused. Olive, she met his gaze. I'd like to court you when you're ready. The breath she drew was steady. I'm not ready yet. But I'm not far. He nodded, and this time when he turned toward the trail, she watched until the trees folded around him, and the dark became still. Inside, the fire burned low, and her hands no longer trembled when she reached for the kettle. The cedar shingles came 2 days later, bound in twine and smelling of resin and sawdust. Rylan hauled them from his wagon before the sun had burned the frost off the porch rail. Olive helped carry them to the barn, sleeves rolled to her elbows, a quiet determination in her step. They worked through the afternoon, Rylan on the roof replacing the warped and split boards, Olive below passing up tools and holding the ladder when the wind picked up. She didn't speak unless necessary, a nod here, a word there, and yet nothing between them felt unfinished. When the last shingle was nailed, Rylan climbed down, wiping his hands on a square of canvas. "You've got a solid roof now," he said. "Won't hear rain coming through it again." Olive stood beside him, watching the line of clouds gathering above the ridge. "That'll be a first." They lingered near the barn, the air thick with the shift of weather. Pearl and Peter were at the Keene place again, helping with spring cleaning. Olive had sent them with a loaf of cornbread and a jar of apple butter and promised to collect them by sundown. "I got a letter yesterday," she said, brushing her palms on her skirt. Rylan tilted his head. "From my brother," she went on. "He's in Boise. Says he heard what happened. Wants me to come out and live near him. Says I could remarry there." Rylan's jaw tightened. "You thinking of going?" "I was," she said. "But I'm not anymore." He didn't hide the way his breath eased. She stepped closer, the tips of her fingers brushing his sleeve. "I don't want to build something just because it's easier. I want to build it because it's right." Rylan's voice was low. "And this feels right. It does." He didn't reach for her yet, just studied her face, the wind catching loose strands of her hair. "I was thinking of buying the plot behind the smithy," he said carefully. "There's a well already, bit of flat land for chickens. I could build a house there." Her brow lifted. "You plan on keeping that for yourself?" "I was hoping not to," he said. "I was hoping to share it." The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncertain. It was full of something steady and growing. Olive looked down at her hands. "I never thought I'd want to marry again." "I'm not asking you to forget anything," Rylan said. "Just asking if you see a place for me here, with you, with the children." She looked up, and this time her eyes didn't guard themselves. "I do." He reached for her hand then, calloused fingers closing gently around hers. "I'll ask you proper when the time is right." "I'll answer proper when it is," she said. They walked the pasture together, past the fence line they'd repaired, past the field starting to soften with the promise of spring. She told him about the wild strawberries that came up near the stone wall in June, and he told her about the peach tree he'd planted behind the livery last summer. Still no fruit, but strong and green. When they reached the edge of the ridge, Olive turned and leaned into him, her back against his chest, his arms circling her with a certainty that didn't need permission. "I used to think peace would come from being left alone," she said. "And now I think it comes from being seen and still being chosen." He kissed her temple, slow and sure. "Then I'll keep choosing you. Every morning you wake beside me." She turned to face him fully, and for the first time she let herself rest her head against his shoulder, not out of weariness but trust. That evening they fetched the children together. Pearl ran into Rylan's arms without hesitation, Peter trailing close behind, proudly handing him a muddy stone he'd found by the creek. Olive watched them with a steady gaze, her heart no longer bracing for the next blow. She reached for Rylan's hand as they walked home beneath the darkening sky, 4 shadows stretching long behind them. They married in early June, beneath the cottonwood where Olive had been born. It was a small gathering, just Mrs. Keene, the children, and a few hands from town who'd come to depend on Rylan's quiet reliability. Pearl wore a crown of wildflowers. Peter refused shoes. Olive wore no veil, only her mother's brooch pinned at her collar. She spoke her vows with a voice clear as creek water. Rylan built their home behind the smithy, just as he'd planned. But it wasn't long before the children insisted on sleeping under the same roof, and so he added 2 rooms, then a porch where Olive liked to sit and mend while the sun dipped behind the ridge. By the next spring, the peach tree bloomed for the first time. Peter planted beans beside it. Pearl drew pictures on scraps of feed sack paper, always with 4 figures, always with their hands joined. There were hard seasons and lean ones. There were fences to mend and sickness to weather. But never again, did Olive feel alone at the end of the day. And every morning, as Rylan poured her coffee and kissed her brow before stepping into the forge's smoke and light, she remembered what it was to be chosen not out of pity or necessity, but for the quiet strength she carried, and the heart she had learned to open again. They grew old together in that wide, wind-swept valley, partners in work, in laughter, in the long silence of love built slow and true, and they never left it. Not once.